The city of Messina, located on the northeastern coast of Sicily, Italy, was once a thriving metropolis known for its rich history, beautiful architecture, and vibrant culture. But on the morning of December 28, 1908, everything changed. What was once a bustling city full of life was struck by one of the deadliest earthquakes in history, forever altering its fate. Messina had long been in a region known for seismic activity. It sits on the edge of the African and Eurasian tectonic plates, making it prone to earthquakes. However, despite this knowledge, the city was not prepared for what was to come. The buildings were constructed with outdated methods and materials that weren't designed to withstand the force of such a powerful earthquake. Streets were narrow, and the infrastructure was old, making the city particularly vulnerable when disaster struck. The fact that most of the population was still asleep when the earthquake hit only worsened the situation, leaving people trapped in their homes and buildings before they even had a chance to react. The earthquake itself struck with devastating force at around 5:30 in the morning. It was a massive 7.1 magnitude quake, but the destruction was made worse by the location of its epicenter just off the coast of Sicily. Not only did the earthquake shake the ground with incredible intensity, but it also triggered a massive tsunami that slammed into the coastline, adding to the devastation. Buildings collapsed, fires broke out, and the streets were filled with dust and debris. People were thrown from their beds and entire neighborhoods were destroyed in seconds. It was an event of epic proportions, but what was even more tragic was how unprepared Messina was for such a disaster. The city had no established emergency protocols, and there were no systems in place to effectively warn the public or respond to such a catastrophic event. Many of the buildings that had once stood proudly in the city center were reduced to rubble, and the few buildings that remained standing were severely damaged. Communication systems were knocked out, and emergency services were unable to respond quickly, further complicating the rescue efforts. This lack of preparedness and poor building standards were major contributing factors to the staggering loss of life. It's estimated that over 70,000 people lost their lives in the earthquake, but the number of casualties could have been even higher if not for the incredible efforts of survivors and international rescue teams. The tragedy would forever be etched into the history of Italy and the world, serving as a stark reminder of the importance of disaster preparedness and the dangers posed by seismic activity in vulnerable areas. In the following parts, we'll dive deeper into the immediate aftermath of the disaster, the struggles of the survivors, and how the earthquake left its mark on both the city of Messina and the world as a whole. But for now, it's clear that the earthquake of December 28, 1908 not only shattered buildings, but also the lives of thousands of people, forever changing the course of history. As the dust began to settle after the devastating earthquake that struck Messina on December 28, 1908, the scale of the destruction became painfully clear. The once thriving city, full of historical landmarks and elegant architecture, was now nothing more than a pile of rubble. Entire neighborhoods were wiped off the map, and the few structures that managed to survive were severely damaged. Fires raged in the chaos, adding to the already overwhelming destruction. What was once a bustling city was now a war zone. The first hours after the quake were chaotic. With the city's infrastructure in ruins, communications were nearly impossible. There were no working telephones, no power lines, and no way to quickly coordinate rescue efforts. What made the situation even worse was that the survivors were left to fend for themselves, as no immediate help arrived from local authorities. Rescue teams were unable to access the most heavily affected areas due to the rubble blocking the narrow streets of the city, making it almost impossible to reach those who were trapped beneath the collapsed buildings. People were left stranded without medical assistance, with many injured, some unable to even move. Hospitals were overwhelmed and medical supplies were running low. Surgeons and doctors were forced to operate in makeshift hospitals, often under dire conditions. What made the situation even more tragic was the fact that so many of the city's emergency services were destroyed or non-functional. It was only after several hours that international aid began to arrive, but for many, it was too late. The city had been left to deal with the immediate aftermath on its own. At the same time, the tsunami that had been triggered by the earthquake caused additional chaos along the coast. The waves, which reached up to 3 meters in height, hit the city of Messina and the surrounding areas, further damaging the already fragile coastal structures and sweeping away entire buildings. The powerful waves caused more casualties, and many survivors who had initially escaped the earthquake found themselves caught in the deadly waves. The Italian government's response to the disaster was slow and uncoordinated. It wasn't until hours after the quake struck that any significant help came from the authorities, despite the growing number of people in need of aid. The lack of preparedness in the face of such a massive disaster left the survivors feeling abandoned, with frustration and anger mounting against the government for not acting sooner. Many people turned to neighboring regions and international organizations for help, hoping that outside assistance would provide the support the city so desperately needed. The impact on Messina's economy was equally devastating. With trade and commerce disrupted for weeks, businesses were forced to close their doors. The economic shockwaves rippled through the region, leaving many people unemployed and without basic necessities. The city's ports, which were once vital to its economy, were heavily damaged, making it nearly impossible to ship goods in or out of the region. In addition to the immediate physical damage, the emotional toll on the people of Messina was profound. Families had lost everything: homes, loved ones, and livelihoods. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out, and those who survived were left to rebuild their lives from the ground up. The psychological trauma of the event would linger long after the physical damage had been repaired, leaving deep scars on the collective memory of the people of Messina. As the days passed and more survivors were pulled from the rubble, the world began to take notice of the disaster. International aid poured in from countries around the globe, offering financial assistance, medical supplies, and teams of rescue workers. The international community came together to help Messina, but the Italian government's delayed response left a lasting sense of bitterness among the survivors. The contrast between the swift actions of foreign aid organizations and the slow response of local authorities further highlighted the deficiencies in disaster preparedness and response at the time. While the devastation was undeniable, the people of Messina showed extraordinary resilience in the face of such overwhelming destruction. Despite the lack of immediate aid, the survivors banded together to support one another, forming makeshift communities and organizing efforts to clear the rubble and search for any remaining survivors. Their determination to rebuild their lives amid such a catastrophic event marked the beginning of a long recovery process, one that would take years and require the collective effort of not just Messina, but the entire country. Next, we'll explore the long road to recovery and the challenges that the survivors faced as they struggled to rebuild their city. As the days turned into weeks after the December 28th, 1908 earthquake, the people of Messina faced the daunting task of picking up the pieces of their shattered city. The scale of the destruction was so vast that rebuilding seemed almost impossible. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened, and the once thriving cityscape was now a scene of chaos and ruin. The survivors, however, showed a remarkable sense of determination. They began to organize and take action, working together to clear the rubble and rebuild their lives from scratch. In the aftermath, it was clear that Messina would need more than just physical reconstruction. It would require a complete overhaul of its infrastructure. The lack of strong building codes, which had allowed for the widespread destruction, became glaringly evident. Many of the structures that had collapsed during the earthquake were old and built without proper consideration for seismic activity. In fact, Italy had not yet developed modern, earthquake-resistant building standards, and the devastation of 1908 underscored the urgent need for change. The rebuilding process was slow and grueling. Resources were scarce, and the city's economy had been severely crippled by the disaster. Many people who had lost their homes were left without jobs, and the once bustling port of Messina was no longer functioning. Yet despite these challenges, the people of the city remained resilient. They worked together to clear the streets and rebuild their homes. Starting with makeshift shelters for those who had lost everything, one of the first priorities was to rebuild the infrastructure that had been so crucial to the city's functioning before the earthquake. Roads and bridges needed to be repaired, and the vital railway system which connected Messina to other parts of Italy had been disrupted. Rebuilding the port, which had been one of the city's main economic engines, was another top priority. Without it, Messina would struggle to recover economically. The Italian government, despite its initial slow response, began to take action in the months following the disaster. It provided some financial assistance and began to work with international organizations to help with the recovery process. However, many people still felt that the government's efforts were insufficient and that more could have been done in the immediate aftermath. The international community also continued to provide aid, and countries around the world sent resources, money, and workers to assist with the recovery. As the months passed, the survivors began to slowly rebuild their homes and businesses, but the city's landscape had been permanently altered. The once beautiful historical buildings that lined the streets of Messina were gone, and many of the city's landmarks, which had taken centuries to build, had been reduced to rubble. The loss was not just physical, it was cultural and emotional. The people of Messina were grieving for their city's past as they worked toward its future. Despite the overwhelming challenges, the earthquake also brought about important changes in Italy's approach to disaster preparedness and urban planning. In the years following the disaster, the country began to implement new laws and building codes that would better withstand future earthquakes. The lessons learned from the Messina earthquake would shape Italy's response to natural disasters for generations to come. The recovery effort also highlighted the importance of community support. In the face of overwhelming adversity, the people of Messina came together, relying on each other for help and strength. Many survivors who had lost their families and homes found solace in helping their fellow citizens rebuild. This spirit of cooperation and solidarity would become one of the defining features of Messina's recovery. In addition to physical reconstruction, there was a growing need for psychological support for the survivors. The trauma caused by the earthquake, the loss of loved ones, and the destruction of homes left many people struggling to cope with the emotional toll of the disaster. Mental health resources were scarce, and it would take time for many survivors to find a sense of normalcy. As the years passed and Messina slowly began to rise from the rubble, it became evident that the city's recovery would be a long-term process. While the physical rebuilding of homes and infrastructure took priority, the emotional and social recovery of the people was just as important. The disaster had left a deep scar on the city, and it would take generations to heal fully. However, the resilience and determination of the people of Messina ensured that the city would eventually recover and rebuild stronger than before. As we continue, we'll explore the long-term effects of the disaster on Messina's people and the city's transformation in the years following the tragedy. The earthquake of 1908, while a source of great loss, would ultimately be a turning point that reshaped the city in profound ways. The Messina earthquake of December 28, 1908 left a profound impact on the people of the city and the wider region of Sicily. The devastation was not just in the loss of lives and property, but also in the emotional and cultural toll it took on the survivors. As the years went by, the full extent of the disaster's effects on Messina and its people became clearer. The earthquake had altered the city's landscape, economy, and society in ways that would be felt for generations. One of the most significant long-term effects of the earthquake was its influence on urban planning and building regulations in Italy. Before the disaster, Italy had very few regulations in place to protect buildings from earthquakes. The collapse of entire neighborhoods during the earthquake highlighted the need for stricter building codes, particularly in earthquake-prone areas like Messina. In the aftermath, Italy made significant strides in earthquake engineering. New laws were introduced that required buildings to be designed with seismic activity in mind. These changes not only helped protect the people of Messina, but also set a precedent for earthquake-resistant construction across the country. The recovery and rebuilding efforts, although slow and arduous, brought about positive change in some areas. The Italian government and international organizations began working together to improve disaster preparedness, and in the following decades, Italy's approach to handling natural disasters became more structured. This led to the creation of better early warning systems and emergency response strategies. While these efforts came too late to save many lives in 1908, they undoubtedly saved countless others in future earthquakes, including the devastating L'Aquila earthquake of 2009. The lessons learned from Messina influenced how Italy and much of the world would approach natural disasters in the years to come. In addition to the physical and structural changes, the Messina earthquake had a profound psychological impact on the survivors. Many people who had lost loved ones, their homes, and their livelihoods struggled to move forward. The trauma of the event was something that could not easily be rebuilt, and it lingered long after the rubble was cleared. Communities had to come together to help each other heal, and families had to cope with grief and loss on a scale that was unimaginable. Counseling and mental health services, while not as developed as they are today, became an essential part of the recovery process. The emotional scars left by the earthquake would take decades to heal fully, and for many, the memories of that fateful day would never be erased. For the city itself, the road to recovery was long. Despite the immense destruction, Messina began to rebuild not just its physical structures, but its identity. The historic center, which had been reduced to rubble, was slowly reconstructed and new buildings were erected with more modern and earthquake-resistant designs. In the years following the earthquake, Messina also saw new industries and economic opportunities emerge as the city adapted to its new reality. While the scars of the past remained, Messina began to find its place once again on the map of Sicily and Italy. The story of Messina's recovery and transformation is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The city, though scarred, rose from the ashes, much like its people. While the earthquake was a tragedy of immense proportions, it also served as a catalyst for change in how cities and nations prepare for natural disasters. The importance of preparedness, resilient infrastructure, and community support in times of crisis became clear, and the world took notice. The Messina Earthquake of 1908 will always be remembered as one of the deadliest natural disasters in history. But beyond the tragedy and loss, it is a reminder of the strength and resilience of the people who lived through it. Their determination to rebuild, recover, and emerge stronger is an inspiring story for future generations. As we reflect on the legacy of the Messina earthquake, we are reminded that natural disasters, while often devastating, can also lead to progress and change. The lessons learned from Messina shaped Italy's approach to disaster response and preparedness, and they continue to guide efforts around the world today. The memory of Messina lives on, not just in the physical landscape, but in the spirit of the people who rebuilt their city and their lives from the ground up. With this final chapter, we conclude our exploration of the Messina earthquake, a tragedy that altered a city, a nation, and the course of history. We honor the lives lost, the survivors who endured unimaginable hardship, and the lasting impact this earthquake had on disaster preparedness worldwide. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. The Great Famine of 1315 was a disaster that changed the course of medieval history, causing widespread suffering across Europe. It lasted for several years and had consequences that rippled through societies, affecting everything from politics to cultural practices. Imagine a time when crops failed, food became scarce, and the climate turned against the people. This was the reality of the Great Famine. The disaster didn't just happen overnight, and its causes were a complex mix of natural and social factors. Before the famine struck, Europe had already been experiencing some tough years. The period leading up to 1315 was marked by a series of harsh winters and cool summers. These unusual weather patterns created an unstable environment for farming, which was the backbone of life during the Middle Ages. Crops weren't growing as they should, and people began to notice the changes in the land. In addition to the cold weather, there were also heavy rains, which flooded fields and ruined what little crop growth had managed to survive. As a result, food became scarce and people started to worry. But these environmental factors were just the beginning. The people of medieval Europe lived in a society where food was a central part of the economy, and most people were dependent on farming. With crops failing year after year, the pressure on the agricultural system grew, making the situation even worse. The people, already struggling from a difficult climate, had to face even more hardship as the food supply dwindled. People relied on the land for their survival, and with the land not providing, they were left in a desperate position. Entire communities found themselves facing a growing food shortage. This wasn't just a problem for the poor peasants. The impact of the famine spread through all levels of society. As people started to feel the effects of the crop failures, social tensions began to rise. The rich and the poor were both affected, but in different ways. The wealthier people could still afford to buy food, but as food prices soared, it became harder and harder to maintain the same standard of living. The poor, who relied on their own crops, had nothing to fall back on. They were the most vulnerable. People were forced to abandon their homes in search of food, leading to a massive migration of people across Europe. As the famine dragged on, it became clear that it wasn't just a temporary setback. People were dying of hunger, and with malnutrition weakening their bodies, diseases spread quickly. The lack of proper medical knowledge and resources meant that many of those who became ill didn't stand a chance. Communities were devastated by the loss of life, and the social order began to break down. It wasn't just a crisis of food, it was a crisis of survival. And as people searched for answers, there was no clear solution to their suffering. It was a period of uncertainty and fear, and many began to look for someone or something to blame. The impact of the famine would go on to shape the course of European history. It was more than just a food crisis, it was a turning point. Society was forced to adapt to a new reality where nothing was guaranteed. This was the beginning of the Great Famine of 1315, an event that would change everything. And as we dive deeper into this story, we'll explore what happened, why it happened, and how it changed the world forever. The Great Famine of 1315 did not just end with the failures of crops or the hunger that followed. The crisis went on to reveal the deep flaws in medieval society. exposing how fragile everything really was. The effects of the famine began to spread far beyond food shortages, influencing the social, political, and economic systems of the time. As the famine worsened, Europe found itself in a state of chaos, struggling to maintain a sense of order and stability. The impact on the population was devastating, and the shockwaves would continue to be felt for years to come. By the time the famine reached its peak, agriculture had been severely disrupted. Fields that once produced bountiful harvests now lay empty or flooded. Even the most successful farmers couldn't escape the destruction. The lack of grain and other basic food sources meant that people were struggling to feed themselves and their families. And the food that could be found was incredibly expensive, pushing the poor further into poverty while widening the gap between the rich and the rest of society. Many landowners were forced to raise the prices of their goods just to cover their losses, creating a perfect storm of economic instability. In the face of this, the nobility and the ruling classes were also not spared. The medieval social system was rigid, and even the wealthy were dependent on a steady flow of food to maintain their position. With their supplies running low, tensions between the wealthy landowners and the lower classes escalated. Some of the nobility began to raise taxes to compensate for their losses, making it even harder for peasants to survive. In some areas, local rebellions broke out as desperate peasants fought for their right to food, seeing no other option but to take a stand. As the famine stretched on, it became clear that there was no easy solution to the crisis. The poor harvests were not only caused by bad weather, but were compounded by the lack of proper farming techniques and resources. Most of Europe's population still relied on outdated agricultural methods, and the social structure kept many people from accessing the tools and knowledge needed to deal with changing environmental conditions. The farmers who were struggling the most didn't have the luxury of experimenting with new methods or crops. They had to make do with what they had, and what they had was not enough. This situation left the most vulnerable people exposed to the harshest consequences. With food in short supply, many of the poorer classes turned to desperate measures. In some cases, communities began to forage for wild plants or even resorted to eating animals they would normally never consider. This, however, wasn't a permanent solution. These alternative food sources didn't provide the necessary nutrition to sustain life for long, and the lack of food and poor diet weakened people's immune systems, leaving them vulnerable to disease. Disease, which had always been a threat, became an even greater danger during the famine. The weakened population was now an ideal breeding ground for illness. Plague outbreaks were common during this period, and they spread more easily due to the malnutrition and overcrowding that came with the famine. People began dying from diseases like dysentery and typhus, in addition to hunger. It's believed that the famine's death toll was made even worse by these diseases, which killed thousands more who were already weakened by lack of food. Social and cultural upheaval also marked the Great Famine of 1315. The constant struggle for survival led many people to turn to their faith, seeking solace in religion. Churches were filled as people prayed for an end to the famine. Some saw the famine as a punishment, believing that it was the result of their sins or divine wrath. Others looked to religious leaders for guidance, but even they were not immune from the suffering. Church leaders were also dealing with dwindling resources, and many were forced to close their doors to the needy. This led to an erosion of trust in the church as people began to question why the divine had allowed such suffering to take place. While many turned to religion for answers, some saw the famine as evidence of deeper systemic problems within medieval society. The rigid class structures, poor governance, and failure to adapt to changing environmental conditions all contributed to the scale of the disaster. The nobility's inability to respond effectively to the needs of their people further fueled dissatisfaction. People were beginning to realize just how interconnected everything was. The breakdown of the agricultural system didn't just affect food, it caused a domino effect that touched every aspect of life, from the economy to religion to the very fabric of society itself. As we continue to explore this dark chapter in history, it's important to understand that the Great Famine wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a reflection of a world that was unprepared for the challenges of its time. The problems it exposed would continue to reverberate throughout Europe for years to come, shaping the course of history in ways that were yet to be seen. The Great Famine of 1315 was not just a crisis. It was a turning point in medieval history, one that showed just how fragile human society really was. And as we move forward, we'll see how these events continued to unfold and what long-lasting effects they had on Europe and beyond. As the Great Famine of 1315 continued to wreak havoc on Europe, it became clear that the catastrophe wasn't just an isolated event. The effects were deeply intertwined with the environmental, social, and economic systems that defined medieval life. While the famine's immediate impact was felt in the loss of food, the long-term effects began to emerge in the form of lasting social changes, economic disruption, and shifts in the balance of power. The consequences would go far beyond the crops that failed, shaping the future of Europe in ways that were difficult to predict. One of the major shifts that resulted from the Great Famine was the movement of people. As the famine persisted, many people in rural areas were forced to abandon their homes in search of food, shelter, or better opportunities in cities. This created a massive migration of people, and for the first time, large numbers of people who were once tied to the land began to seek refuge in urban centers. Cities, which had already been struggling with overcrowding, now found themselves overwhelmed with the influx of people. This sudden increase in population put immense pressure on resources, further exacerbating the food shortages and leading to even more social unrest. The cities themselves, however, weren't much better off. As agriculture failed, trade routes were disrupted, and towns that relied on rural supplies found themselves with empty markets. Urban populations were also hit hard by the famine, with many people now forced to rely on what little could be found in the cities. Prices for food soared to unattainable heights, and as wealth became increasingly concentrated in the hands of those who controlled the remaining food supplies, tensions rose between the wealthy and the impoverished. The rising cost of food, combined with the scarcity of work, led to social unrest in the cities, and some urban areas saw outbreaks of riots and violence. In some cases, desperate citizens took to the streets to protest their conditions, demanding that the ruling classes address the crisis. But despite their protests, little help came. The famine's economic impact also extended far beyond the immediate consequences of crop failures. The collapse of the agricultural system sent shockwaves through the medieval economy, which was primarily dependent on farming. The agricultural losses not only affected the food supply, but also devastated the trade in agricultural goods. Landlords, unable to produce the crops they relied on, began to struggle financially. Many were forced to borrow money from local moneylenders, and with debts piling up, some landowners were unable to keep up with their obligations. This led to the bankruptcy of several large estates, creating a ripple effect that affected the entire economy. Trade networks that were vital for the distribution of food and goods across Europe were also hit hard. The famine disrupted transportation routes, making it difficult for food to reach its destination. Merchants who once thrived in the movement of goods found their markets drying up, and many traders found themselves unable to pay their workers or keep their businesses afloat. Without the necessary food and goods flowing through the region, many people found themselves in desperate situations, forced to take whatever jobs they could, often at reduced wages or under deplorable conditions. The ripple effects of these economic disruptions lasted long after the famine ended, contributing to further instability in the years that followed. The devastating environmental changes that were occurring during this time were also central to the ongoing crisis. The Little Ice Age, which began around the turn of the 14th century, was a period of colder temperatures and extreme weather. This global cooling affected Europe in particular, and the consequences were felt in every corner of the continent. Cool summers, harsh winters, and excessive rainfall led to poor harvests and crop failures, which were further compounded by the lack of effective farming techniques. Without the ability to grow enough food, entire communities were left vulnerable to the ravages of famine. These climatic conditions didn't just affect crops, but also the animals that people relied on for food and labor. Livestock also suffered during this period, with many animals dying from diseases that spread rapidly in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of the time. This had a further impact on the food supply, leaving people with even fewer resources to survive. One of the key factors that made the famine so devastating was the lack of understanding about the climate and its changes. Medieval society had no concept of climate change in the way we do today, and the people living through the Great Famine were left struggling to comprehend what was happening. There were no modern scientific tools to predict weather patterns, and the knowledge needed to adapt to such drastic changes simply didn't exist. This lack of knowledge meant that communities were largely unable to prepare for the drastic environmental shifts, and when the climate began to turn, there was no way for people to adjust. As a result, the impact of the famine was much more severe than it would have been had there been greater awareness and understanding of the situation. The famine also highlighted the vulnerabilities of medieval society. especially the ways in which social and political systems were not equipped to respond to such a widespread crisis. The feudal system, which had dominated Europe for centuries, left peasants at the mercy of the land and their lords. In times of hardship, the poor were the first to suffer, and the wealthy landowners had little incentive to change the system that kept them in power. The growing dissatisfaction with the ruling classes fueled anger among the lower classes, and in some areas, this unrest led to revolts. The strain on the social fabric of society became clear as people who had once been bound to their estates began to question their place in the world. The Great Famine of 1315 was not just a disaster, it was a wake-up call. It exposed the fragile nature of medieval life, where a few bad harvests could lead to widespread catastrophe. It revealed the deep economic divides that existed between different classes and showed how a small change in the environment could cause massive social and political upheaval. The impact of the famine, combined with the existing hardships of the time, would set the stage for even greater challenges in the years that followed. The reverberations of the famine would continue to affect Europe for decades, and its lessons would not be easily forgotten. As we look at the aftermath, we'll see how these events shaped the course of European history and influenced the future of the continent in profound ways. As the Great Famine of 1315 continued to devastate Europe, the social and political consequences of the crisis began to unfold. The strain on the population, combined with the widespread hunger and suffering, began to erode trust in the established systems of power. The Church, which had long been seen as a spiritual and social anchor in European society, found itself facing increasing criticism. Many believed that the famine was a form of divine punishment, and as a result, the Church's ability to provide solace to the suffering masses was tested like never before. Despite the Church's traditional role as a source of comfort, people began to question its authority and its failure to provide effective aid during such a catastrophic event. The religious explanations for the famine, such as the idea that it was a punishment for sin, did little to alleviate the suffering of the masses. As the famine dragged on, many began to feel that the Church was disconnected from their daily struggles. Instead of providing tangible help, the Church seemed to focus more on maintaining its power and wealth. This led to widespread disillusionment among the lower classes, who had long looked to the clergy for guidance and support. In some cases, this distrust would fuel the growing dissatisfaction with the existing social order. The nobility, too, found themselves facing increased pressure. Many of the landowners who had relied on agricultural production for their wealth found themselves in financial ruin. Unable to meet their obligations or provide for their peasants, some noble families were forced to sell off land or take on massive debts. The economic instability caused by the famine weakened the foundations of the feudal system, and many peasants began to push for reforms. In some regions, this led to uprisings and revolts as the lower classes sought to hold the nobility accountable for their perceived negligence. These acts of resistance were not always successful, but they revealed the growing divide between the rich and the poor and demonstrated the cracks in the feudal structure that had once been so dominant in Europe. One of the most significant consequences of the Great Famine was its impact on the workforce. As the famine continued, many people were unable to work due to illness or malnutrition. This severely disrupted the agricultural sector, which was heavily dependent on manual labor. Fields went untended, and crops that might have survived the difficult weather conditions were left to rot. This not only exacerbated the food shortage, but also had a ripple effect on other industries that relied on agricultural goods. The shortage of workers in agriculture also meant that wages for those who were still able to work rose, but these higher wages were often not enough to offset the rising cost of living. Those who were employed were often working in appalling conditions, with little protection from the effects of the famine. As a result of the labor shortages, the agricultural system in many parts of Europe began to shift. With fewer peasants available to work the land, some lords turned to more intensive farming techniques or adopted different crops that might be more resilient to the changing climate. However, these efforts were not always successful, and many areas continued to suffer from crop failures. Some regions experienced a shift in the types of crops that were grown, with more emphasis being placed on livestock and dairy farming as a way to diversify the food supply. This shift would have lasting consequences for the agricultural economy, as it set the stage for changes in farming practices that would continue for centuries. The collapse of the agricultural system also had a profound effect on trade. With fewer crops to trade, the movement of goods across Europe slowed to a crawl. The disruptions to transportation networks and the loss of food and raw materials led to the collapse of many local markets. Merchants who had once thrived in the bustling towns found themselves unable to sell their goods, and many traders were forced to abandon their businesses altogether. This economic collapse had a ripple effect on all levels of society, from the poorest laborers to the wealthiest merchants. For many, the famine was a stark reminder of how fragile the medieval economy was and how easily the complex web of trade, labor, and agriculture could unravel. The social unrest caused by the famine and the economic instability it created also had political ramifications. In some regions, the local nobility began to lose control over their subjects, as peasants and workers grew more disillusioned with the existing order. The revolts that broke out in response to food shortages and economic hardship were sometimes brutally suppressed, but they also highlighted the tensions that were simmering just below the surface. In the aftermath of the famine, many rulers realized that they needed to take action to restore order and rebuild the trust of their people. Some turned to new methods of taxation or introduced policies designed to stabilize the economy, while others sought to strengthen their authority through force. The political landscape of Europe was forever changed by the famine, and in some areas, the power of the nobility would never fully recover. The Great Famine's long-lasting impact on Europe would not be fully felt until years later, but it set the stage for many of the challenges that would face the continent in the coming centuries. The environmental changes that triggered the famine were only the beginning. The social, political, and economic consequences of the disaster would continue to ripple through European society for generations to come. The famine exposed the fragility of the medieval world and demonstrated how a combination of climate, social unrest, and economic instability could combine to create a perfect storm of disaster. In the years that followed, Europe would face even greater challenges, including the Black Death and the 100 Years' War. But the lessons learned from the Great Famine of 1315 would never be forgotten. The world would never be the same again. The Great Famine of 1315 marked a turning point in the history of Europe. It not only caused immense suffering, but also set in motion a series of events that would shape the future of the continent. As the famine slowly began to subside, the long-term consequences became clear. The environmental, social, and political upheaval it caused would continue to influence Europe for generations to come. The effects of the disaster would ripple through society, leaving a lasting legacy that would help define the Middle Ages. In the wake of the famine, Europe faced new challenges that only deepened the sense of instability. The loss of life, the economic collapse, and the weakening of the feudal system left the continent vulnerable to further disruptions. For many, the famine had exposed the fragile nature of medieval society and the vulnerability of the people who lived within it. As the population began to recover, Europe's leaders struggled to rebuild and stabilize their kingdoms, but the damage had already been done. Trust in the ruling classes had been shattered, and many people began to question the traditional power structures that had once been so dominant. The church, which had long held a position of authority, found its influence waning. The suffering caused by the famine, combined with the church's failure to offer effective relief, left many people questioning its role in society. Over time, this disillusionment contributed to a rise in skepticism and a challenge to the authority of the clergy. Though the church remained a powerful institution, the seeds of the religious reform movements that would later shake Europe were planted during this period. Politically, the aftermath of the famine saw the rise of new social movements. Peasants and workers who had borne the brunt of the suffering began to demand changes to the existing order. The failure of the feudal system to protect the most vulnerable led to growing unrest, and some regions saw the rise of peasant revolts. While these uprisings were often brutally suppressed, they signaled a growing desire for change. The old system of land ownership and labor was no longer able to provide the stability it once had. In the years that followed, Europe would experience further upheavals, including the Black Death, which would decimate the population once again. The lessons learned from the Great Famine, however, would remain as a reminder of the fragility of life. Economically, the long-term consequences of the famine were profound. The agricultural system, which had been the backbone of medieval society, was forever changed. The labor shortages and the devastation of crops led to a shift in farming practices, with some regions moving away from traditional crops in favor of livestock and dairy. The collapse of the markets and the disruption of trade routes led to a decline in the prosperity of many regions. Though recovery was possible, it would take years before the economy could regain its previous strength. The economic instability created by the famine also paved the way for future conflicts, including the 100 Years' War, which further strained Europe's resources. As Europe slowly recovered from the famine, the scars left by the disaster remained. The environmental changes that had triggered the crisis were not easily forgotten. The extreme weather events that had caused the crop failures continued to serve as a reminder of how unpredictable nature could be. While some areas rebuilt and regained their former stability, others were left in ruin. The Great Famine had exposed the vulnerability of the medieval world and shown how quickly things could unravel when a crisis struck. The tragedy of the Great Famine of 1315 left an indelible mark on European history. It was a reminder that even in the most prosperous times, society could be brought to its knees by a combination of environmental, social, and economic forces. The lessons learned from this catastrophe would resonate through the centuries, as Europe faced further challenges in the form of war, plague, and political instability. Yet even in the face of such devastation, humanity's ability to rebuild and adapt would remain a constant theme in the centuries to come. As we look back at the events of the Great Famine and its aftermath, we are reminded that history is not just a series of isolated events, but a complex web of interconnected forces that shape our world. The legacy of the Great Famine is a powerful reminder of the fragility of human civilization and the need to understand and learn from our past. The scars left by the famine may have faded, but the lessons of resilience and the importance of unity in the face of adversity remain as relevant today as they were in the early 14th century. On the night of April 26, 1986, the world changed forever. At the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine, an explosion ripped through Reactor 4, releasing massive amounts of radiation into the atmosphere. The disaster unfolded in a matter of seconds, but its consequences would last for generations. What was meant to be a routine safety test turned into one of the worst nuclear accidents in human history, a catastrophe so severe that its effects are still being felt today. The Chernobyl power plant was part of the Soviet Union's push for nuclear energy, a symbol of technological progress. Located near the city of Pripyat, the plant housed 4 operational reactors, with 2 more under construction at the time of the disaster. Reactor 4, the one that would explode, had been in operation for just 3 years. The plant used RBMK reactors, a Soviet design that had serious flaws that were ignored for the sake of rapid expansion. The accident occurred during a late-night test meant to determine whether the reactor could still be cooled if the plant lost power. To conduct the test, operators disabled several key safety systems, something that should never have been done under normal conditions. Due to a combination of human error, poor reactor design, and a lack of proper safety protocols, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. A sudden power surge led to 2 massive explosions, blowing off the reactor's heavy steel and concrete lid. Flames shot into the night sky, and within moments, a deadly cloud of radioactive material was released. The force of the explosion was so powerful that pieces of the reactor were hurled across the plant grounds. Firefighters, unaware of the radiation exposure, rushed to the scene to battle the flames. Many of them had no protective gear, and within minutes of arriving, they began experiencing severe symptoms of radiation poisoning, dizziness, vomiting, and intense burns. The graphite from the reactor core burned fiercely, and as the fire raged, radioactive particles were carried by the wind, spreading across Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond. Despite the magnitude of the disaster, the Soviet government initially downplayed the severity of the explosion. Pripyat, a city built to house the plant's workers and their families, was not immediately evacuated. For over 36 hours, residents continued their daily lives, completely unaware that they were being exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. Children played outside, families attended school and work, and life went on as if nothing had happened. It wasn't until radiation levels spiked in Sweden nearly 1,000 miles away that the world realized something was terribly wrong. By the time the Soviet government acknowledged the disaster, the damage had already been done. Pripyat was finally evacuated on April 27th, but by then thousands of people had already been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. Buses lined the streets as residents were ordered to leave immediately, taking only what they could carry. Many never returned. The city, once a thriving community, became a ghost town overnight, abandoned in a desperate attempt to escape the invisible threat that lingered in the air. As the Soviet authorities scrambled to contain the disaster, the full scale of what had happened was only beginning to be understood. The explosion had not just devastated the reactor, it had created an ongoing crisis that would require massive resources and human sacrifice to control. The response in the days and weeks ahead would determine how much worse the situation would become, and for those who remained at the plant, the danger was far from over. In the chaotic hours following the explosion at Reactor 4, Soviet officials struggled to grasp the full extent of the disaster. The immediate priority was to extinguish the raging fires and prevent further explosions, but the situation was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. With radiation levels climbing to lethal amounts, every decision carried life or death consequences. The first responders, many of whom were local firefighters, had unknowingly walked into a death trap. They had been called to the scene, believing it was a routine industrial fire, unaware that they were stepping into one of the most radioactive places on Earth. Without protective gear, they fought the flames with water, completely exposed to the intense radiation streaming from the destroyed reactor core. Within hours, many of them began experiencing severe symptoms: nausea, dizziness, and painful burns. Caused by radiation penetrating their bodies, some collapsed on the spot. Despite their suffering, they continued working, trying desperately to contain the disaster. Meanwhile, inside the control room of Reactor 4, plant workers struggled to understand what had happened. Many refused to believe that the reactor had exploded. It was not just denial, it was the result of years of Soviet propaganda promoting the idea that their reactors were completely safe. Some operators were ordered to manually pump cooling water into what was left of the core, exposing themselves to deadly radiation in the process. Others tried to restore power to the plant, unaware that their efforts were futile. The damage had already been done. As news of the explosion spread among Soviet leadership, there was hesitation about how to respond. The government's instinct was to cover up the severity of the situation. Officials debated whether to alert the public or keep the disaster a secret, fearing international backlash and damage to the Soviet Union's reputation. While these discussions took place behind closed doors, people in Pripyat continued their daily routines, completely unaware that invisible radioactive particles were already settling over their city. Radiation levels in and around the plant were astronomical. Readings on dosimeters, devices used to measure radiation exposure, quickly maxed out. Some devices even failed entirely due to the extreme radiation. Despite this, government officials were reluctant to acknowledge the scale of the catastrophe. Scientists who raised concerns were ignored or silenced. And it wasn't until radiation alarms at a Swedish nuclear plant detected unusual activity that the Soviet government was forced to admit that something had gone terribly wrong. Finally, more than a day after the explosion, evacuation orders were given for Pripyat. Residents were told that they had only a few hours to gather their belongings. They were reassured that they would be able to return soon, but in reality, none of them would ever see their homes again. The evacuation was rushed, with long lines of buses stretching down the roads, carrying thousands of people away from the growing nuclear crisis. The eerie silence that followed would mark the beginning of Pripyat's transformation into an abandoned city, frozen in time. Even after the residents were removed, the danger remained. The destroyed reactor was still emitting dangerous amounts of radiation, threatening to spread even further. The Soviet government now faced the impossible task of stopping an ongoing nuclear disaster with limited knowledge, outdated equipment, and workers who had no idea what they were stepping into. The next phase of the response would require unprecedented human sacrifice, as thousands of people were sent into Chernobyl's radioactive ruins to prevent an even greater catastrophe. In the days following the explosion, Soviet authorities faced an overwhelming crisis. With Reactor 4 still spewing radioactive material into the air, the priority was to contain the spread before it reached catastrophic levels. However, with radiation levels so high that even machines failed, the task fell largely to human workers, thousands of whom would later be known as the liquidators. These liquidators were made up of soldiers, firefighters, plant workers, and volunteers, many of whom had little to no understanding of the dangers they were walking into. They were tasked with clearing debris, disposing of contaminated materials, and constructing makeshift barriers to slow the release of radiation. Some were even ordered to shovel highly radioactive graphite off the reactor roof, a task so dangerous that they were only allowed to work for seconds at a time before being replaced. Even with such short exposure, many suffered from acute radiation poisoning. One of the most urgent threats was the risk of a second explosion. Below the damaged reactor, a massive pool of molten nuclear fuel was burning through the concrete foundation. If it reached the large water reservoirs beneath the plant, the resulting steam explosion could have been powerful enough to contaminate much of Europe with lethal radiation. To prevent this, a group of 3 engineers and plant workers volunteered for a near-suicidal mission, diving into the flooded basement to drain the water manually. Their efforts succeeded, preventing what could have been an even greater catastrophe. At the same time, Soviet scientists and engineers worked to construct a massive concrete structure known as the sarcophagus to encase the reactor and limit further radiation release. It was a rushed effort, built under extreme conditions, and it would later require major reinforcement. But at the time, it was seen as the only viable solution to stop the crisis from spiraling further out of control. As the response continued, the Soviet government finally admitted to the world that an accident had occurred. However, the full scale of the disaster was still downplayed. Only after increased radiation was detected in other countries did more details start to emerge. International pressure grew, forcing the Soviet Union to take more drastic action. Scientists and nuclear experts from around the world offered assistance, but political tensions made collaboration difficult. Meanwhile, the effects of radiation exposure were beginning to take a toll. Hospitals became overwhelmed with liquidators and first responders suffering from radiation sickness. Many of these individuals had no idea they had been exposed until symptoms appeared: burns on their skin, organ failure, and in many cases, fatal complications. Despite the growing crisis, thousands more workers were sent to continue the cleanup, some with little more than cloth masks and basic protective suits. By this point, the abandoned city of Pripyat had become a haunting reminder of the disaster. Houses, schools, and amusement parks sat untouched, frozen in time. Personal belongings were left behind as residents had expected to return. Over time, nature began reclaiming the city, but the radiation levels remained dangerously high. The Chernobyl disaster was no longer just a Soviet problem. It had become an international concern. Scientists and world leaders debated how to prevent similar disasters in the future, but the full consequences of Chernobyl were still unfolding. The disaster's impact on human health, the environment, and even politics would continue to grow in the months and years ahead. As the months passed, the full scale of the Chernobyl disaster became clearer. The radiation released into the environment was not just a local problem. It spread across vast regions, carried by the wind and contaminating land, water, and food supplies far beyond the borders of Ukraine. Belarus, in particular, suffered heavily, with large portions of its farmland becoming unsafe due to radioactive fallout. Even areas in Western Europe detected elevated radiation levels, forcing some countries to take drastic measures, such as banning the sale of contaminated food products. One of the most alarming long-term consequences was the impact on human health. While many of the liquidators and first responders suffered immediate effects from radiation exposure, the true cost of the disaster would be measured over generations. Increased cases of thyroid cancer, particularly in children, became one of the most well-documented health effects. This was largely due to the release of radioactive iodine, which was absorbed by the thyroid gland through contaminated milk and other food sources. In response, medical studies were launched to track the long-term health effects of radiation exposure, with scientists trying to understand how deeply Chernobyl had altered human DNA. Birth defects, immune system disorders, and other illnesses were reported among populations exposed to high levels of radiation, but the full impact remains debated to this day. The Soviet government and later the Ukrainian government set up programs to provide compensation and healthcare to victims, but resources were often limited. Meanwhile, the long and complicated process of decontaminating the affected areas had begun. Entire villages were abandoned, with buildings demolished and soil removed in an attempt to reduce radiation levels. In some cases, entire forests were bulldozed and buried because the trees had absorbed dangerous amounts of radiation. The exclusion zone, covering thousands of square miles around the plant, became a permanent no-go area, with only a few elderly residents choosing to return despite the risks. Wildlife in the exclusion zone also faced major consequences. Many animals showed signs of genetic mutations, while others, including birds and large mammals, struggled to survive in the altered environment. Over time, however, something unexpected happened. Nature began to reclaim the abandoned land. With no human interference, populations of wolves, bears, and other wildlife started to thrive, creating a strange paradox. An area once deemed too dangerous for humans became a haven for animals. Despite these changes, the damaged reactor remained a major concern. The hastily built sarcophagus that covered Reactor 4 was not designed to last forever, and over the years, cracks, and structural weaknesses began to appear. If it collapsed, radioactive dust could once again be released into the air, causing another environmental crisis. To prevent this, an international effort was launched to build a new containment structure, one of the largest engineering projects ever undertaken. Known as the New Safe Confinement, this massive steel structure was designed to completely enclose Reactor 4 and prevent further radiation leaks. It was carefully constructed and then slid into place over the existing sarcophagus, a feat that required precise planning and execution. This new barrier was designed to last for at least a century, buying time for future generations to find a permanent solution to the dangers posed by the reactor's remains. Even with these efforts, Chernobyl remains an ongoing challenge. The disaster reshaped nuclear policy worldwide, leading to stricter safety regulations and renewed debates about the risks of nuclear power. Some countries moved away from nuclear energy entirely, while others doubled down on improving safety measures. The lessons of Chernobyl continue to influence discussions about energy, safety, and government transparency, ensuring that its legacy will not be forgotten. Decades after the Chernobyl disaster, its impact is still being felt in ways both seen and unseen. While the exclusion zone remains largely uninhabited, scientists, researchers, and even tourists visit the area to study its long-term effects and witness the eerie remains of what was once a thriving community. Pripyat, the abandoned city near to the power plant, stands frozen in time, a haunting reminder of the sudden evacuation that took place all those years ago. Buildings crumble, nature overtakes the streets, and personal belongings remain scattered as if waiting for their owners to return. Despite ongoing concerns about radiation, Chernobyl has also become a site of great interest for scientists studying how ecosystems adapt to extreme conditions. Wildlife has flourished in the absence of human activity, with some species showing resilience to radiation exposure. While mutations and shortened lifespans have been observed in certain animals, others appear to be thriving, raising new questions about nature's ability to recover from nuclear disasters. At the same time, there is still no clear solution for dealing with the long-term storage of nuclear waste from the disaster. While the new safe confinement structure provides a temporary solution for Reactor 4, the question remains what will happen when it, too, reaches the end of its lifespan. The effort to decommission the plant and safely manage its radioactive materials will continue for generations, requiring constant attention and funding. The people most affected by Chernobyl, those who were evacuated, the liquidators who risked their lives, and the families who lost loved ones, continue to fight for recognition and support. Some survivors still struggle with health problems linked to radiation exposure, while others have spent years advocating for justice and better assistance. The disaster exposed the dangers of government secrecy and the consequences of ignoring safety concerns, lessons that many believe should never be forgotten. Chernobyl also serves as a warning for the future of nuclear energy. While advances in technology have made modern reactors safer, the disaster remains a symbol of what can go wrong when human error, flawed designs, and poor decision-making collide. The event changed the way the world viewed nuclear power, leading some nations to phase it out, while others work to improve safety standards. The debate over nuclear energy's risks and benefits continues, shaped in part by the haunting legacy of Chernobyl. Though decades have passed, the Chernobyl disaster remains a powerful reminder of how one moment in history can alter the course of the future. The lessons learned from this tragedy have influenced global policies, scientific research, and public awareness about the dangers of radiation and the need for transparency in times of crisis. While efforts to contain and manage the site continue, the story of Chernobyl will always stand as a cautionary tale, one that must never be ignored or forgotten. La Palma, part of Spain's Canary Islands located in the Atlantic Ocean off the northwest coast of Africa, is often celebrated for its natural beauty. Known as La Isla Bonita, or the Beautiful Island, it boasts lush forests, dramatic cliffs, and stunning volcanic landscapes. Beneath its scenic surface, however, lies a powerful and unpredictable force of nature, the Cumbre Vieja volcanic ridge. The Cumbre Vieja volcano is not only one of the most active volcanic systems in the Canary Islands, but also a focal point for scientific study due to its complex structure and history of eruptions. This volcanic ridge runs across the southern part of La Palma and has been the site of multiple eruptions over the past 500 years. Notable eruptions include those in 1585, 1646, 1712, and more recently 1949 and 1971. The volcano's most destructive event, however, occurred in September 2021 when it erupted after 50 years of dormancy. The 2021 eruption didn't come entirely without warning. Leading up to the event, scientists had detected an increase in seismic activity, small earthquakes known as tremors, beneath the surface of La Palma. These tremors signaled that magma was moving upward through the Earth's crust, pressurizing the volcano. Local residents and scientists alike knew the signs were ominous, and tensions grew in the days before the eruption. Despite efforts to monitor the situation, the sheer scale and longevity of what was to come surprised even seasoned geologists. When the eruption finally began on September 19, 2021, fissures along the Cumbre Vieja Ridge opened, releasing fountains of lava, ash, and toxic gases. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Streams of molten rock, glowing red against the landscape, spewing from multiple vents as plumes of ash rose thousands of feet into the sky. Over the course of the eruption, lava flowed relentlessly, consuming everything in its path and completely transforming the island's topography. Historically, eruptions from the Cumbre Vieja volcano have shaped not only the landscape, but also the lives of those who call La Palma home. While these events bring devastation, they are also reminders of the island's volcanic origins. The Canary Islands were formed millions of years ago by volcanic activity, with La Palma being one of the youngest islands in the archipelago. Its volcanic soils are rich and fertile, making the island ideal for agriculture, especially banana plantations and vineyards. However, this same volcanic legacy means that life on La Palma has always been a delicate balance between beauty and destruction. As the events of 2021 began to unfold, attention turned to the human and environmental impact of the eruption. With molten lava swallowing homes and agricultural land, the eruption quickly became a devastating disaster for local communities. While the island has experienced eruptions in the past, the intensity and prolonged duration of this event captured global attention. Scientists, journalists, and residents bore witness to the volcano's raw power as the story of La Palma's eruption continued to unfold. As we continue, we'll explore the eruption's impact on local communities, the environment, and the unprecedented challenges it posed to those living in its shadow. As the Cumbre Vieja eruption intensified, the people of La Palma faced challenges that few could have prepared for. Within hours of the volcanic fissures opening on September 19, 2021, lava flows surged down the slopes of the volcano at a relentless pace, engulfing roads, homes, schools, and farmland. The destruction was swift and merciless. Some families were given mere moments to flee their homes, grabbing only essential belongings before the advancing lava turned their neighborhoods into smoldering wastelands. Entire communities were displaced as the eruption showed no sign of slowing. The lava itself was extraordinary in its sheer volume and reach. Moving at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, the molten rock consumed everything in its path, burying structures under layers of black volcanic crust that hardened into a new landscape. By the time the eruption ended, it had covered over 1,200 hectares of land, roughly the size of 1,500 football fields. More than 7,000 residents were forced to evacuate, many of whom would return months later to find their homes and livelihoods wiped off the map. One of the most devastating impacts was on agriculture, the backbone of La Palma's economy. The island is famous for its banana plantations, which account for nearly 50% of its economy. Lava flows destroyed thousands of acres of farmland, leaving many farmers without a source of income. Even those whose fields were spared faced other challenges. Thick layers of volcanic ash blanketed crops, suffocating plants and rendering the land unusable. Water supplies became contaminated as ash settled into reservoirs and pipes, exacerbating the crisis for both agriculture and everyday life. The environmental toll was just as severe. As the eruption continued, huge plumes of ash and sulfur dioxide were released into the atmosphere, creating a health hazard for residents. Authorities urged people to stay indoors, wear masks, and keep windows closed to avoid inhaling toxic particles. Air quality worsened not just on La Palma, but also on neighboring Canary Islands. Strong winds carried the ash as far as mainland Europe, where skies turned hazy and flights were disrupted. Meanwhile, the molten lava flowing into the Atlantic Ocean created an entirely new danger. When lava meets seawater, it causes a chemical reaction that produces toxic steam clouds containing hydrochloric acid and fine glass particles. This phenomenon, known as LAYS, lava haze, pose serious risks to residents and emergency workers in coastal areas. Authorities established exclusion zones along the shoreline to prevent people from getting too close to the toxic clouds, which could cause breathing difficulties and eye irritation. The eruption's relentless destruction sparked an unprecedented emergency response from local, national, and international agencies. Spain declared La Palma a disaster zone, unlocking funds for aid and recovery. Emergency shelters were set up to house evacuees, and volunteers flooded in to provide food, clothing, and emotional support. Drone technology and satellite imaging were deployed to monitor lava flows and provide real-time updates, helping authorities make critical decisions about evacuations and safety zones. Despite their efforts, the emotional toll on residents was immeasurable. Families who had lived on the island for generations were left grappling with uncertainty, unsure of when or if they would ever be able to return to the lives they once knew. The landscape of La Palma was forever changed, and the human cost of the disaster was etched into the hearts of those who lived through it. As we continue, we will delve deeper into the scientific significance of the eruption, examining how researchers studied the volcano's behavior and what insights it provided into volcanic activity and disaster preparedness. The Cumbre Vieja eruption on La Palma was not just a natural disaster, it was also a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for scientists to study the inner workings of an active volcano in real time. For volcanologists, geologists, and climate scientists around the world, the eruption provided invaluable data and insights that could help predict and prepare for similar events in the future. The eruption began with a series of small tremors known as a seismic swarm, which started weeks before the first fissures opened on September 19, 2021. These tremors were a crucial signal that magma was rising from beneath the Earth's crust, pushing toward the surface. Thanks to advances in monitoring technology, including seismographs, GPS sensors, and satellite imaging, scientists were able to track the magma's movement and provide early warnings to the public. This level of real-time monitoring played a vital role in saving lives, as it allowed authorities to evacuate residents before the lava began its destructive march. One of the most remarkable aspects of the eruption was the formation of new volcanic vents along the ridge of Cumbre Vieja. Over the course of 85 days, a network of fissures opened, releasing lava and gases from multiple locations. This multi-vent activity made the eruption particularly complex and unpredictable. Scientists closely analyzed the chemical composition of the magma, which revealed that it originated from deep within the Earth's mantle. The lava was classified as basaltic, a type of magma that is fluid and fast-moving, which explained why the flows traveled such long distances, consuming entire communities in their path. Beyond the visible destruction, the eruption also triggered geophysical changes across the island. The weight and movement of the lava caused parts of La Palma to deform and sink. Satellite imagery captured these subtle changes to the island's topography, giving scientists a clear understanding of how volcanic eruptions reshape landscapes over time. These findings are crucial for predicting the long-term effects of volcanic activity in other volcanic hotspots, such as Hawaii or Iceland. One area of significant scientific focus was the interaction between the lava and the Atlantic Ocean. When the lava reached the coastline, it created new landforms, adding roughly 48 hectares of land to the island. This process, known as lava deltas, is a rare but fascinating phenomenon. However, scientists warned that these newly formed areas are unstable and prone to collapse, posing risks to anyone venturing too close. Studying these formations offered valuable insights into the geological processes that shape islands and coastal regions around the world. The eruption also sparked global discussions about climate change and its role in natural disasters. While volcanic eruptions are natural geological processes, their environmental impact cannot be ignored. The release of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and ash into the atmosphere temporarily affected regional air quality and contributed to climate variability. In fact, the sulfur dioxide emissions created a visible aerosol layer that cooled parts of the atmosphere for a short period, an effect scientists continue to analyze as they study the complex relationship between volcanic activity and the Earth's climate. For researchers, the eruption underscored the importance of disaster preparedness and early warning systems. In recent years, technological advancements have significantly improved scientists' ability to monitor seismic activity, but the unpredictability of volcanoes remains a major challenge. By studying the eruption of La Palma, scientists are refining their models to better predict volcanic behavior, which could save countless lives in the future. The data collected during this eruption also provided opportunities for education and outreach, with footage and findings shared widely across media platforms and scientific communities. Volcanologists on the ground worked tirelessly to explain the science behind the eruption to the public, ensuring that people understood the risks while highlighting the importance of scientific research in mitigating future disasters. In the next part, we'll explore the resilience of La Palma's communities and their ongoing efforts to recover and rebuild in the wake of the eruption's devastation. Despite the destruction, the people of La Palma have shown extraordinary strength and determination in rebuilding their lives amidst a dramatically changed landscape. As the lava flows finally stopped in December 2021, the island of La Palma was left with a transformed and scarred landscape. What was once a thriving community surrounded by lush agricultural fields had become a scene of devastation, blanketed in volcanic rock and ash. Entire neighborhoods were erased, with more than 3,000 buildings destroyed and over 7,000 residents evacuated from their homes. In the wake of the destruction, the focus quickly shifted to recovery, both for the people of La Palma and for the island's delicate environment. The eruption caused catastrophic economic losses, particularly for La Palma's agriculture sector, which is a critical part of the island's economy. The volcanic flows wiped out banana plantations, vineyards, and other farmlands that employed thousands of people. The banana industry alone, which accounts for half of La Palma's economy, suffered significant setbacks, with farmers facing the challenge of restoring plantations buried under thick layers of volcanic ash. Many are working tirelessly to clear debris and reclaim the fertile soil beneath. Meanwhile, government and European Union funds have been directed towards supporting farmers and other affected industries to help them get back on their feet. One of the most inspiring aspects of La Palma's recovery has been the resilience of its people. Despite the challenges, the community has come together to help one another rebuild their lives. Shelters were set up for displaced families, and volunteers provided food, clothing, and emotional support. Fundraising efforts across Spain and beyond brought in much-needed resources, demonstrating how disasters often highlight the strength of human solidarity. Schools reopened, temporary housing was provided, and local businesses began the difficult process of rebuilding. However, the path forward is not without obstacles. The volcanic ash and hardened lava have created new challenges for infrastructure. Roads, power lines, and water systems that were buried or destroyed now need to be reconstructed from the ground up. Some regions remain cut off, requiring innovative solutions to reconnect isolated communities. Scientists and engineers have been working alongside authorities to develop new infrastructure plans that consider the island's volcanic risks, ensuring that rebuilding efforts are sustainable and better prepared for potential future eruptions. Environmental recovery has also become a major focus. The lava flows dramatically reshaped La Palma's coastline, adding new land to the island while simultaneously damaging fragile ecosystems. Marine life near the lava deltas was severely impacted as the sudden influx of hot material into the ocean disrupted habitats and water quality. Scientists are now closely monitoring the regeneration of marine ecosystems, which will take years to recover fully. On land, efforts are underway to plant trees and restore greenery in areas that were covered in ash, with researchers studying how volcanic soils can eventually support new plant life. The eruption of Cumbre Vieja also served as a stark reminder of the importance of disaster preparedness and long-term planning. In response, local authorities are investing in early warning systems and community education programs to ensure that residents are better informed about volcanic risks. The success of the 2021 evacuations, which prevented any loss of human life, highlighted the effectiveness of modern monitoring systems and communication strategies. Moving forward, these lessons will play a critical role in minimizing the impact of any future eruptions on the island. For scientists, La Palma has become an important case study in volcanic activity and disaster management. The data collected during the eruption continues to shape our understanding of volcanoes and the processes that drive them. By learning from the events on La Palma, scientists can refine their predictive models, helping other volcanic regions around the world prepare for similar events. Today, La Palma stands as a symbol of both nature's raw power and humanity's resilience. The scars of the eruption remain, but so does the determination of the island's people to rebuild, recover, and thrive. For those who visit La Palma now, the volcanic landscape tells a story of devastation and rebirth, a testament to the island's enduring spirit. As we reflect on the eruption, it's a powerful reminder of how fragile and interconnected life on Earth is. Whether through earthquakes, tsunamis, or volcanic eruptions, natural disasters remind us of the importance of preparedness, scientific research, and community resilience in the face of adversity. What are your thoughts on this incredible story of survival and recovery? Let us know in the comments below, and if you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about the forces of nature and the resilience of communities across the world. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. The Irish Potato Famine, also known as the Great Hunger, is one of the most tragic and defining events in Irish history. The famine took place from 1845 to 1852, and it left a permanent mark on the country and its people. It's an event that still gets talked about today, with many people looking back at the impact it had on Ireland's culture, economy, and population. But what exactly happened, and why was this famine so devastating? At its core, the famine was caused by the failure of the potato crop, which was a major food source for the Irish population. The potato had become the staple crop for many Irish peasants, especially in rural areas. It was a cheap and easy crop to grow, and it provided a reliable source of nutrition for families, particularly those living in poverty. However, in 1845, a disease called Phytophthora infestans, also known as potato blight, began to spread across Ireland, wiping out entire crops of potatoes. This blight made the potatoes rot, leaving them inedible, and causing an immediate food shortage. The situation quickly worsened, with the blight returning year after year, making it impossible to harvest enough potatoes to feed the population. By 1847, the crisis was in full swing, and famine was widespread. It wasn't just a bad crop failure here and there. The entire food system of Ireland was brought to its knees, but while the cause of the famine seems simple, a failed potato crop, the true reasons behind the tragedy go much deeper, and it's here where we begin to see the full scope of the disaster. The Irish population was already struggling under difficult conditions before the famine hit. Ireland, under British rule at the time, had long been a poor and exploited country. Many Irish people were tenant farmers, which meant they didn't own their land and were at the mercy of landlords who often raised rents. The land was divided into small plots, and these small farmers were forced to rely heavily on a single crop for their survival: the potato. This over-reliance on one crop made the population vulnerable to disaster when that crop failed. But the potato blight wasn't the only factor that made the famine so deadly. The British government's response, or rather lack of response, made the situation even worse. The British authorities at the time believed in a policy called laissez-faire, which essentially meant that they thought the market should take care of things without interference. The idea was that people should be left to fend for themselves, and that the government should not be directly involved in providing aid. This hands-off approach proved to be disastrous, especially in a crisis like the potato famine. The Irish people needed help, but the British government was slow to act. When they did intervene, it was often too little, too late, or poorly executed. British officials focused on sending food exports out of Ireland, believing that they would be more useful to the economy if shipped abroad rather than being used to help the starving population. This policy was met with growing outrage and despair as people continued to starve. As the famine stretched on, the death toll began to rise dramatically. It's estimated that over 1 million people died from hunger, disease, and malnutrition. Thousands more fled Ireland, seeking refuge in other countries, particularly the United States. The mass emigration created a diaspora of Irish people who would carry the memory of the famine with them for generations. The impact was so profound that it reshaped Ireland's demographic makeup, and many Irish families would never return to their homeland. In the midst of this devastation, the Irish people displayed incredible resilience despite the British government's failures. Local communities banded together to provide what little support they could. Soup kitchens were set up, donations were collected, and groups organized protests in an attempt to bring attention to the famine's severity. While the government was slow to act, The Irish people's determination to survive and support one another was remarkable. So, what does this all mean? The Irish potato famine was not just a natural disaster caused by a crop failure. It was a tragedy born out of a combination of bad weather, political neglect, and social inequality. It was a moment in history that changed Ireland forever, and its legacy continues to shape the country today. But as we'll see in the next part, the famine was more than just a tragic event. It was also a turning point that would spark change and lead to a rethinking of how governments should respond to disaster and human suffering. Stay tuned as we explore more of the complexities of the Irish potato famine and how its lasting impact continues to echo through history. The Irish potato famine wasn't just a disaster caused by the failure of a single crop. The broader circumstances in Ireland made the famine much worse and helped fuel its devastating consequences. Before the blight ever arrived, Ireland was already struggling under a system of inequality and poverty that made it highly vulnerable to disaster. The impact of the famine was deeply tied to a mix of British colonial policies, the structure of Irish society, and economic pressures that had been building for years. By the time the famine hit, much of the Irish population had already been living in dire conditions. Many Irish people were tenant farmers, meaning they rented their land from landlords rather than owning it. This system left farmers at the mercy of rent demands, and when times were tough, they had little control over their ability to provide for their families. The Irish peasants were heavily reliant on the land for survival, but the small plots of land they worked on made them extremely vulnerable to crop failures. The widespread use of the potato as the main source of food meant that when the crop failed, so did the livelihoods of the people. Over-reliance on the potato wasn't just a cultural choice, it was the result of economic pressures that forced many Irish farmers to rely on a single crop for survival. During the early 1800s, the British government passed a series of laws that severely restricted the rights of Irish tenants. These laws made it harder for Irish farmers to hold on to their land and forced many to depend on a crop that could be grown quickly and on small plots, the potato. The potato was cheap to grow, nutritious, and could feed entire families, but its widespread use across Ireland made the country highly vulnerable to any problems with the crop. When the potato blight first hit in 1845, it was a major shock, but the true devastation didn't set in until later. The blight wiped out nearly half of Ireland's potato crop in that year alone, but it wasn't just the blight that caused mass starvation. The social and economic structures of Ireland made the problem far worse. Without enough food to feed the population, Irish peasants had few options. Many were already living on the edge with little access to proper nutrition or medical care. With so many people relying on potatoes for their daily diet, there were few alternative food sources when the crop failed. The British government, which ruled over Ireland at the time, didn't seem to fully grasp the scale of the crisis. British officials were primarily concerned with the economy and maintaining control over Ireland, not the well-being of the Irish people. As the famine worsened, the British government was slow to respond. They didn't want to interfere with what they saw as the natural workings of the market, even as millions were starving. This laissez-faire attitude, which means letting things take their course without interference, meant that very little relief was provided to the Irish people. Instead of sending aid, British policies focused on exporting food from Ireland, thinking that keeping the economy going would eventually solve the problem. But this decision only made things worse, as food was being taken from the country while millions of people went hungry. Meanwhile, the British government passed laws like the infamous Gregory Clause, which prohibited relief to anyone who owned more than a quarter of an acre of land. This clause was meant to encourage the poor to leave their farms and seek work elsewhere, but in practice, it left many with a choice between starvation or homelessness. In the face of all this hardship, the Irish people were left to fend for themselves. Despite the lack of government assistance, many communities took matters into their own hands. People organized soup kitchens, helped one another with what little food they had, and worked together to try to survive. There were also protests and demonstrations as the Irish people expressed their anger at the British government's inaction. While many suffered in silence, these acts of defiance showed that the Irish people were far from helpless. They had a fierce determination to survive, even in the worst of circumstances. As the famine stretched on, more and more people died, not just from starvation, but from diseases like typhus and dysentery, which spread quickly in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. The death toll is hard to estimate precisely, but it's believed that at least 1 million people died during the famine. In addition to the deaths, millions of others were forced to leave Ireland in search of a better life. The Irish diaspora, particularly to the United States, grew dramatically during and after the famine, as people fled the dire conditions in Ireland. The mass emigration that followed had a lasting impact on Ireland. Entire communities were lost, and the population of Ireland dropped by about a quarter. This also meant that the famine's consequences were felt not just in Ireland, but in the countries where Irish immigrants settled, especially in America. The legacy of the famine shaped the identity of the Irish people for generations, influencing both the Irish who remained in Ireland and those who started new lives in foreign lands. So what was the impact of all this? The Irish potato famine was not just a food crisis, it was a turning point in Ireland's history. The failure of the British government to provide meaningful assistance during this crisis led to deep resentment and anger toward the British. Many Irish people began to see the famine as a direct result of British colonialism and policies that treated the Irish as second-class citizens. This anger would eventually lead to a push for independence and reform in the following decades. The potato famine, while a tragedy, also played a key role in shaping Ireland's path to the modern era. As we continue to explore the deeper complexities of the famine, we can start to see the long-lasting effects it had on both Ireland and its people. It wasn't just a period of loss, but one of profound change. Stay tuned on for the next part of this story, where we will look at how the British government's policies and the Irish response to the famine set the stage for the future. As the famine deepened, the effects of British policies became even more apparent. The British government's response, or lack of it, was one of the most controversial aspects of the potato famine. While the Irish population struggled to survive, the British government continued to follow a policy of non-intervention, under the belief that market forces would eventually balance things out. But this idea, which worked in some situations, was disastrous when applied to the desperate conditions in Ireland. The British approach ignored the scale of the crisis, the unique situation in Ireland, and the human suffering that was taking place. The economic theory of laissez-faire, which believed in minimal government involvement, was ill-suited to handle such a catastrophic event. At the heart of this failure was a series of decisions that prioritized economic interest over human lives. One of the most glaring examples of this was the continued export of food from Ireland during the famine. Even though millions of people were starving, Ireland's ports were still exporting grain, meat, and other essential foodstuffs to Britain and other countries. This was driven by the British government's economic policies, which prioritized keeping trade flowing and maintaining the stability of the market. While Irish people were dying from hunger, their own resources were being shipped abroad. To make matters worse, when relief efforts were provided, they were either too little or too late and often poorly managed. The British government set up workhouses where the Irish could go for food and shelter, but these were overcrowded and poorly maintained, and many people were turned away. The workhouse conditions were so bad that many would rather risk starvation than enter them. Public works projects were also introduced, but these too failed to alleviate the suffering. While some infrastructure was built, the projects were insufficient to meet the needs of the population, and the workers were often paid poorly, which made it hard for them to support their families. British relief efforts were slow, ineffective, and often seen as an afterthought rather than a true attempt to save lives. The British government also imposed policies that were seen as punitive rather than helpful. One of the most infamous examples of this was the introduction of the Gregory Clause in 1847. This clause, named after Sir William Gregory, a British politician, stated that only those who owned less than a quarter of an acre of land were eligible for relief. The idea was to encourage people to leave their land and go to the cities to find work, but in practice, this policy devastated the Irish poor, forcing many of them to choose between starvation or giving up their homes. It was a clear example of how the British government's response was more concerned with maintaining social control than with alleviating the suffering of the Irish people. Meanwhile, the Irish people were left to fend for themselves, and they responded in ways that showed both their resilience and frustration. As the government failed to act, communities began to organize their own relief efforts. Soup kitchens were set up, donations were collected, and people worked together to support one another. In many areas, the Irish created their own forms of resistance, including protests and demonstrations, to demand better treatment from the British authorities. Though these actions were often small and localized, they demonstrated the defiance and strength of the Irish people. They refused to accept the status quo, even in the face of such overwhelming adversity. But even with the best efforts of the Irish people, The famine continued to rage. Over the course of the famine, it's estimated that 1 million people died from hunger and disease. Another million were forced to emigrate, mainly to the United States, where Irish immigrants began to form a significant part of the population. The Irish diaspora, which had been growing steadily, swelled dramatically during and after the famine. Many of those who survived found themselves starting over in foreign lands, leaving behind the poverty and despair that had gripped their homeland. The emigration caused by the famine had lasting effects on both Ireland and the countries that received the Irish immigrants. In Ireland, the population dropped by nearly a quarter, and entire communities were lost. Those who stayed behind were left with the memory of the tragedy and the resentment toward the British government that would continue for decades. For the Irish immigrants, the famine was a defining moment. It shaped their identity and played a role in the rise of Irish nationalism, particularly in the United States. The Irish, who had once been seen as an underclass in their homeland, now began to rise in prominence in their new communities, fueled by the trauma of the famine and their desire for a better life. The Irish Potato Famine was not just a food crisis, it was also a political and social crisis. It exposed the deep inequalities that existed in Ireland and the callousness of British policies toward the Irish people. It showed how British colonialism, combined with the lack of effective government response, could lead to catastrophic consequences. And it revealed the strength and determination of the Irish people, who refused to accept their fate and found ways to survive, even in the face of overwhelming odds. By the time the famine began to subside in 1852, its effects were already felt far and wide. The social, political, and cultural landscape of Ireland had been forever altered. The famine had not only caused immense human suffering, but it also ignited a spark of resistance that would continue to burn in Ireland for years to come. As we look at the aftermath of the famine and its lasting impact on Irish society, we can begin to understand why this event is still so deeply felt today. Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where we will examine the long-term effects of the famine on both Ireland and the world. As the years passed after the Irish Potato Famine, the long-term effects of the tragedy continued to shape both Ireland and the broader world. The loss of nearly a quarter of the Irish population, both in death and emigration, left Ireland in a state of deep social and economic upheaval. Entire communities had been wiped out, and those who remained were often traumatized by the horrific events they had witnessed. The famine's aftermath was not just about dealing with immediate starvation and poverty. It was about the profound psychological scars it left on the Irish people and their sense of identity. One of the most significant effects of the famine was the mass emigration of the Irish population, particularly to the United States. An estimated 1 million Irish men, women, and children left Ireland during and after the famine, seeking a better life across the Atlantic. This migration was not just a flight from hunger, it was a desperate attempt to escape the economic and political circumstances that had contributed to the famine in the first place. The Irish, who left behind their homeland, found themselves in a strange new world, where they faced their own set of challenges, but also the possibility of a fresh start. In the United States, Irish immigrants were often met with hostility and discrimination, as many Americans viewed them as a poor, uneducated, and undesirable group. However, over time, the Irish immigrants would prove themselves to be resilient and hardworking, slowly carving out a place for themselves in American society. They became an important part of the labor force, particularly in cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, where they worked in factories, on railroads, and in construction. The Irish also began to build their own communities, churches, and institutions, creating a strong cultural identity that was rooted in their experiences of hardship and survival. This massive wave of immigration would also have significant effects on the political landscape of the United States. The Irish immigrants, many of whom were poor and working class, found a voice in the country's burgeoning labor movement. They played an instrumental role in pushing for better working conditions, higher wages, and the right to form unions. The Irish also became increasingly involved in politics, with Irish Americans eventually rising to power in major cities and even in the US Congress. This political influence would continue to grow throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as Irish Americans became a formidable political force in the United States. Back in Ireland, the effects of the famine were no less profound. The population had been decimated, and the country's rural economy was in shambles. The devastation caused by the failure of the potato crop, coupled with the economic policies of the British government, had left the Irish people with little means of recovery. The lack of investment in the country's infrastructure and the British government's continued neglect only exacerbated the situation. Despite the aid provided by Irish communities and emigrants abroad, recovery was slow. The land itself had been severely damaged by years of over-reliance on the potato, and many farmers were unable to rebuild their livelihoods. The famine also brought to the forefront the deep political and social divisions between the Irish people and the British government. The anger and resentment toward British policies that had fueled the famine never fully dissipated. In fact, the famine became a rallying point for Irish nationalism. Many Irish began to view the famine as a clear example of British neglect and oppression, and it strengthened calls for Irish independence. The memory of the famine would continue to fuel political movements in Ireland for decades, and it played a significant role in the push for home rule and eventually full independence. In the decades following the famine, the Irish people began to rebuild their communities and their country. Despite the devastating loss of life and the trauma left by the famine, the Irish displayed remarkable resilience. They sought to preserve their culture, language, and traditions, even as they faced tremendous odds. The Irish language, which had been in decline for years, experienced a revival as a symbol of national pride and resistance to British control. Cultural institutions, such as theaters, museums, and schools, were founded to promote Irish identity and history. In the global context, the Irish potato famine also had far-reaching effects. It is often seen as a catalyst for broader social and political movements, particularly in relation to food security and the rights of colonized peoples. The famine highlighted the dangers of monoculture farming, the over-reliance on a single crop, and the vulnerabilities of agricultural societies. It also exposed the risks of unchecked market policies and the devastating impact they can have on vulnerable populations. The global awareness of the Irish tragedy led to increased activism for food aid and social justice, as well as growing support for movements that sought to protect the rights of the impoverished and disenfranchised. Over time, the Irish potato famine became a symbol of survival and struggle. It was a defining moment in Irish history that continued to shape the country's political, social, and cultural landscape. The famine not only reshaped the lives of those who lived through it, but also left a legacy of activism and resistance that would echo throughout generations. As we reflect on the effects of the famine, we begin to see how such tragedies can spark change, giving rise to new ideas and movements that push for justice and equality. In the next part of this story, we will explore how the famine continues to impact Irish identity and global memory, and how its legacy is still felt today. As we reach the final part of this story, it's important to reflect on the long-lasting impact of the Irish potato famine and how it continues to shape Ireland and its people today. The Great Hunger, as it's often called, remains one of the darkest chapters in Irish history, and its repercussions can still be felt across the world. The famine was not just a devastating loss of life, it was a pivotal moment that changed the course of history in Ireland, influenced the global political landscape, and left an imprint on generations of Irish people, both in Ireland and abroad. One of the most profound ways the famine has shaped Irish identity is through the deep sense of loss and survival that remains at the core of the national consciousness. For many Irish people, the memory of the famine is not just about the tragedy of those years, but about the strength and resilience of those who endured it. Even as the famine devastated Ireland, it also created a new sense of unity among the Irish people, one that transcended geographical boundaries. The shared experience of suffering and loss became a bond that would last for generations, uniting the Irish diaspora around the world. This sense of solidarity can still be seen today, especially in the way the Irish community comes together to remember the victims of the famine. Every year, on the anniversary of the famine's peak, Irish people hold memorials and events to honor those who perished and to reflect on the ongoing struggles faced by marginalized communities. These events serve as a reminder of the resilience of the Irish people, and they continue to foster a deep sense of pride in the country's history, culture, and ability to overcome adversity. The legacy of the famine also extends to the political and social movements that it inspired, particularly in Ireland's fight for independence. The trauma of the famine played a significant role in the rise of Irish nationalism, as many began to view British colonial rule as the cause of their suffering. This sentiment fueled the demand for Irish self-rule and eventually led to the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922. The Irish nationalist movement, which gained momentum after the famine, would go on to shape the political landscape of Ireland for much of the 20th century. In addition to its role in fostering Irish nationalism, the famine also had a lasting effect on the global awareness of food security, colonial exploitation, and the treatment of vulnerable populations. The Irish Potato Famine highlighted the dangers of food dependency and the devastating consequences of market-driven policies that put profits before people's well-being. It also shone a spotlight on the effects of British imperialism, which had already been a point of contention for many colonized nations. The world began to take a closer look at the treatment of impoverished populations, and the tragedy of the famine led to increased advocacy for social justice, humanitarian aid, and more equitable agricultural practices. While the Irish Potato Famine may have been a disaster of incomprehensible scale, it also acted as a catalyst for change on both a national and global level. The lessons learned from this dark chapter in history continue to influence policies on food security, the rights of the oppressed, and the importance of government responsibility in times of crisis. Today, as we reflect on the famine, we are reminded of how human-made tragedies can be caused by a mix of greed, neglect, and inequality, and how those tragedies, though painful, can also spark movements that fight for justice and human dignity. In Ireland, the memory of the potato famine continues to be a symbol of perseverance and hope. It reminds the Irish people, and indeed the world, that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, there is always the possibility for renewal and change. The famine, with all its devastation, laid the groundwork for a stronger, more independent nation and a more engaged and compassionate global community. Through the pain and the loss, Ireland found a renewed sense of purpose and identity, one that would go on to shape the country's future and its place in the world. As we conclude this story, we can't help but see the Irish Potato Famine as more than just a tragic event. It is a story of survival, resilience, and the enduring power of human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. The famine not only shaped the course of Irish history, but it also shaped the world's understanding of hunger, colonization, and the need for social change. And in the end, it serves as a powerful reminder of the ways in which even the darkest moments can lead to brighter futures. Thank you for taking this journey through history with me, and I hope this story has given you a deeper understanding of one of the most devastating yet transformative events in Irish history.